in the case of removing an item, it's going to be the exact same code as we used to add items. So we can go ahead and just copy and paste this code here. And do you know why that's the case? It's because all we're saying is that there have been edits, there have been manipulations to this list of items that I have, and I need you to update with the new value. So it doesn't matter that we're adding in one case or removing in another. All we're doing is saying, hey, this HTML has changed and we need to update local storage appropriately. So similarly, that's exactly what we'd want to do in the case of adding that completed class or, crossing an item off as well. But let's go ahead and just give this a shot now. You're going to see the complication with this. Returning back to the browser. Okay, so now that we've persisted our data, let's go ahead and add another item. And let's go ahead and remove this persist data. So we're just confirming that remove is actually working. And let's go ahead and cross this item off. Now, refreshing the page. Well, the good news is that the item we removed, that persisted. So that's great. But you can see that this completed class stuck around. We actually have the class still on our item. But the checkbox isn't persisting as checked. So how are we going to do that? Let's go ahead and have a look at the jQuery code. I actually already have this open, but if we look at manipulation, the first thing I want to actually point out is that in the case of the checkbox input, checked is an actual attribute that exists on an input. So what we want to do is persist that checked attribute at its current state. So if it's checked, we want to persist that. And as long as that's visible in our HTML, that's going to be saved to local storage. So when we get our local storage item again, when we reload our page, that checkbox or that check mark should persist. So with that piece of information, we're going to use a method in this case called attribute. This can get or set the value of an attribute. So considering that checked is an attribute of an input checkbox, let's return back to our code. So what we're basically going to do is target our checkbox. We need to access this checkbox, and then we need to use this attribute method. But in this case, we already have access to this, literally this, because in the case of our function here, this scope actually is returning to us the checkbox because that's the first element being selected. So we can go ahead and access our checkbox using this, and we're going to use that attribute method like I said. So the attribute in this case is checked. And when the checkbox value changes, in that first case, for instance, we want to go ahead and set that checkbox, that checked attribute to checked. So let's go see how this is actually working in the code. Back to the browser. And we're going to reset this page here. So keep an eye on our list element here. We have our input checkbox right here. So now, when we check the checkbox, we can see that the checked attribute is getting added and it's being set to checked. So this now is going to persist. If we refresh the page, that has been saved in our local storage and it's going to be continue to stay checked. But let's go ahead and uncheck it. We've already clearly had a little discrepancy in our behavior. But even upon unchecking it, you can see that it still says checked. So what do you think is going to happen when we refresh the page? Well, our checkbox is still persisting, but now we don't want it to. So let's return back to our code and fix this. So back in our code now, how do you think we're going to handle a situation like this? Well, to give you a clue, it's something we actually used in our first function here, and it's going to be a condition. We want to determine if the checkbox is checked we would like to uncheck it. And if it is unchecked, we would like to check it. Just as this change behavior is handling our toggle, we need to be able to assess the value of checked in order to know how to proceed. So we're going to do our if statement in this case, and we'll work on the conditions in a moment. But let's go ahead and actually move this into an else statement. I will explain in just a moment. So our condition in this case is going to reference whether the checked attribute is true. So if the checked attribute is just true, we actually want to remove this checked attribute. And if it's false, if it's not currently checked, we actually want to add the checked attribute and set it to checked. So here in our first if statement, how we're going to tackle this is by using our checkbox. And instead of setting the attribute now, we can actually use another method available to us if we hop back into the code, or the documentation, I'm sorry. And you'll notice something called remove attribute. So that's basically just going to do the inverse. We are actually going to remove the attribute from our input checkbox. So we're going to pass remove attribute. And in this case, we don't need to specify the value. We're just going to pass in the attribute that we want to remove. So what is our condition? Well, considering that in one instance, we will have an attribute of checked, set to checked, and in another instance, that checked attribute won't exist at all. Our condition is to just actually check whether there is an attribute of checked on this input. So in that case, we're just going to actually see if the attribute checked exists. So by doing this and only passing in one argument, we're passing in the actual name of the attribute. In this case, we're passing in two arguments, and that was actually setting the value of that attribute. But in this case here, we're actually just saying, hey, does this attribute checked exist? If it does, remove it. And if it doesn't, go ahead and add it. So let's go see if that actually works. Save the code, and returning back to the browser, I'm going to go ahead and remove this item for now. Let's start fresh with a new item. Okay, so let's check this off here, and let's add another item. And let's go ahead and check this item off, but then uncheck it. And refresh the page. We should see no change to the way our data exists now. And there we are. So now our local storage is persisting exactly as we intended. Whether our items are added, removed, or edited, it's being accounted for and saved in the local storage. So if the user were to ever delete their local storage, what you can do by just actually right-clicking here and clicking delete, these items clearly aren't going to persist. So this isn't the most protective option. Ideally, we would want a backend database that the user can't interact with in this way. However, this is a great option for now, and local storage can do some really powerful things for us. So now we've taken one big step forward as to seeing what's available to us on the front end, and your jQuery skills are getting to pretty top notch. So in our next project, we're actually going to be tackling simulated data that would be returned from our server, which is a much more realistic scenario, and we'll see how we work with it then. But awesome job, and I'll see you for the next project.